Now, this weekend, something happened that's not unusual. My words were taken completely out of context, twisted, distorted, and I was relentlessly attacked. I would like to respond to those attacks that were headlined, "Fauci calls Ron Johnson's aide comments preposterous." Fauci said, "I don't have any clue what he's talking about." Fauci blasts Ron Johnson for saying he overhyped AIDS. Preposterous. Anthony Fauci rips GOP Senator Ron Johnson's preposterous accusations he's overhyped COVID. So what did I say? That sounds terrible. Well, what I said was in response to a radio talk show host, Brian Kilmeade's question asking about the Omicron variant. He said, "It looks benign. I mean, mild symptoms, mostly people under 40. So I answered his question about Omicron, talking about Muller's ratchet. It's a phenomenon. It makes sense how viruses generally mutate, how they become more contagious because they want to replicate, so they become more contagious, but generally less lethal because it doesn't help replication if you kill your host. Now, nothing's guaranteed. That would be the general direction of the variants of the coronavirus. Why would we assume anything worse? But that's what the COVID gods are doing. They are assuming the worst. They are using every new variant to keep us in the state of fear that they have created to maintain control over our lives and rob us of our freedom, to impose freedom-robbing vaccine mandates, again, that are preposterous. There's a good use of that word. That are pointless, that are idiotic. But after talking about that state of fear, I went on to say, and by the way, Fauci did the exact same thing with AIDS. He overhyped it. Now, full stop. That is where the news media stopped. And then accused me falsely of downplaying AIDS. I have never, nor would I ever, downplay the tragedy that is AIDS, that is COVID. These are serious, deadly diseases. They've killed hundreds of thousands. I would never downplay them. When I said overhyped, I explained exactly what I was talking about in the next 6 words. I said he created all kinds of fear, saying it could affect the entire population when it couldn't. He's using the exact same playbook for COVID. And here's the key point that I want to talk about a little bit later. Ignoring therapy, pushing a vaccine. The solution to this pandemic, I've always thought, was early treatment. We still haven't robustly explored early treatment, and that's a travesty. Now, Dr. Fauci on the show said this criticism of him, creating a state of fear, is preposterous. But let's go to what he actually said back in May of 1983. Now, I was alive in May of '83. I understand how unsettling this new disease was. I understand the state of fear, the legitimate state of fear. But responsible health officials should not have stoked it, and Dr. Fauci did. He authored an article in the Journal of American Medical Association stating, quote, "The possibility that routine close contact, as within a family household, can spread the disease." He added, "If indeed the latter is true, then AIDS takes on an entirely new dimension. And then, if we add to this possibility that non-sexual, non-blood-borne transmission is possible, the scope of the syndrome may be enormous." Now, it's important to note, these aren't off-the-cuff comments. This was in a column he wrote with forethought. Dr. Fauci knew what a delicate time we were as the public's awareness of this disease was emerging, when people were already frightened by what they were hearing. He was in a position of authority. He knew what he said carried weight and would be disseminated, and it was. The following day, headlines in the United Press International published a story headlined, "Household Contact May Transmit AIDS." The next day, the Associated Press ran a story asking, "Does AIDS spread by routine contact?" The same day, the New York Times article read, quote, "Family contact studied in transmitting AIDS," and it invoked Fauci's article in discussing the possibility of transmission between family members. He stoked the fear, and it, quite honestly, continues to this day. He stigmatized AIDS patients for years with his fear-mongering. Now, less than 2 months later, in June of 1983, Dr. Fauci flip-flopped, and he publicly contradicted his own fear-mongering by stating, quote, "It is absolutely preposterous." He likes that word, by the way. "It is absolutely preposterous to suggest that AIDS can be contracted through normal social contact, like being in the same room with someone or sitting on a bus with them." I mean, you heard what he said 2 months earlier, right? If he felt it was so preposterous on June 26th, why had he raised the fear, stoked the fear, just 2 months earlier? Now, it's interesting, I just found out last night that not only did he write that article stoking the fear, he started giving interviews. I've seen an interview where he basically uses the exact same words, but now he denies it. He wants to deny the reality of what he said, what he did. He wants to rewrite history. And by the way, when it comes to the AIDS crisis, rewriting history, I'm not the only one that is accusing him of that. In an article published or updated last on December 6th in 2017 in the Huffington Post, in their comment platform, which I guess has since been taken down, an author of a book, his name is Sean Strub, wrote an article, wrote a blog for the HuffPost. The book Mr. Strub wrote was Body Counts, a memoir of politics, sex, AIDS, and survival. And he describes it as how he recounts how slow the federal government was in publicizing the use of Bactrim and other sulfa drugs to prevent PCP, which is the pneumonia that was then the leading killer of people with AIDS, in addition to its long time and well-known use to treat that type of pneumonia. So let me quote from Mr. Strub's article. He said, "Dr. Anthony Fauci is rewriting history. He is doing so to disguise his shameful role in delaying promotion of an AIDS treatment that would have prevented tens of thousands of deaths in the first years of the epidemic." The article goes on to say, in 1987, pioneering AIDS activist Michael Callan begged Fauci for help in promoting the use of Bactrim as PCP prophylaxis and issuing interim guidelines urging physicians to prophylax those patients deemed at high risk for PCP. The article goes on. Had Fauci listened to people with AIDS and the clinicians treating them, the doctors with the courage and compassion to treat AIDS patients, and responded accordingly, he would have saved thousands of lives. In the 2 years between 1987, when Callan met Fauci, and 1989, when the guidelines were ultimately issued, 2 years, nearly 17,000 people with AIDS suffocated from PCP. Most of these people might have lived had Fauci responded appropriately. Another doctor, Dr. Barry Gingle, I'm continuing with the article here, a medical advisor to gay men's health crisis, met with Fauci to plead for his support. They didn't just say there was, quote, this preliminary activity and some small trials, as Fauci claims. They explained that many frontline AIDS physicians, following the lead of Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, were already using Bactrim effectively to prevent the recurrence of PCP. The science was clear. A decade before, critical trials by Dr. Walter Hughes had proven its efficacy in preventing PCP in other immune-compromised populations, like children with leukemia. It continues. Fauci refused to acknowledge the evidence, and according to one account, even encouraged people with AIDS to stop taking treatments like Bactrim that weren't specifically approved for use in people with AIDS. Dr. Sonnabend wrote in 2006, quote, why in the case of AIDS was Bactrim, a known preventative measure against PCP, introduced so many years after a need for it had been recognized? To this must be added the question of why this neglect, the consequences of which can be measured in the tens of thousands of lives lost, has received almost no attention. The media has continued to cover for Dr. Fauci. The article goes on, if we don't tell the truth about the history of the AIDS epidemic, it will be subject to more whitewashing, as we witnessed this weekend, my aside. More distortions and more rewriting to suit the legacies of the officials in charge. These are the same officials who seem incapable of ever acknowledging or taking responsibility for the mistakes they made, mistakes that cost our community thousands of lives. Now, Mr. President, why did I take so much time to read an excerpt from this article from 2017? It's because it's the major point I was making in my comments to Brian Kilmeade.